So that's where a lot of what we do at Infinite Giving and in the book, Funding Your Mission, is like, how do we reframe these conversations to where
Mm,
it's about thoughtful stewardship and intentionality around funds. It's not about hoarding.
yeah.
It's not about not having faith. It's not about not wanting to deploy the funds, because that's why we're here, is to do the good work. But there is a balance of, hey, we should have reserves. Hey, we should be able to, give someone a raise when they're doing really good work. We should be able, when we need to replace something
Yes.
on a broken building, we should be able to do that.
Hello, I am Brian Grosso, the CEO of Simple Charity, a nonprofit that inspires and educates and equips Christians to love generously like Jesus. The nonprofit sector is a $1.4 trillion sector in the U.S. economy. That's 5% of U.S. GDP. $600 billion of that $1.4 trillion comes from donated dollars, and the remaining $800 billion comes from earned revenue and government grants. Today, I talk with Karen Houghton, the author of Funding Your Mission and CEO of Infinite Giving, all about nonprofit finance and how this sizable sector can manage their funding and their money in order to accomplish their missions. How can nonprofits wisely steward their wealth? Why are cash reserves important? What are endowments? And is it possible for nonprofits to have too much cash reserves? What are the differences between endowments, private foundations, and donor-advised funds? This is a bit of a technical conversation, but it's filled with wise nuggets, especially for nonprofit leaders, fundraisers, and philanthropists. So I hope you join me. Ultimately, this is a conversation about how nonprofit staff can have health and abundance as they execute on their very important missions at the highest possible level. Join me for a conversation about nonprofit finance with Karen Houghton. This is your podcast. So as always, send me your thoughts, questions, and suggestions at Brian with an I at simplecharity.org. And if the show is helpful to you, please click a 5-star rating in your podcast app, whether that's Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or a different platform. And if you're watching on YouTube, please click subscribe. All these little actions help a lot to get the show out to more listeners. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're with us today.
Hi, my name is Melissa, and I serve as a Simple Charity philanthropic advisor to individuals, couples, families, foundations, and family offices in the Raleigh-Durham, Chapel Hill area of North Carolina, but also to clients around the country. If you're curious about your own generosity journey and would like help thinking through a philanthropic strategy with intentionality to discern where God is calling you to love people, to find excellent nonprofits to partner with, or to understand the impact of your current grant making, I would love to connect and share more about Simple Charity's philanthropic advising offerings. You can connect with me at Melissa Hall at simplecharity.org. That's Melissa Hall at simplecharity.org. And you can learn more about us at simplecharity.org. That's simplecharity.org.
Karen, welcome to the Simple Charity Podcast.
Hey, Brian, good to be here.
What are you grateful for today?
Do I have to pick just one?
You can pick more than one.
Okay. I'm in Atlanta, Georgia, and so it is sunshiny yet cold, and I am indoors, and I had a good lunch, and my daughter's gonna get off the bus soon. So it is a good day of finding those small
Mm,
things that can grant us joy.
that is awesome. That's a great. How old is your daughter?
She is
Karen?
9, so we're in 4th grade.
She's 9. Oh, okay, nice. And she's riding the bus. That's
Yeah.
like a
9 is fun because,
sweet
like,
girl thing.
yeah, she's independent and, like, has all
Yeah,
these big thoughts, and we can have real conversations, but she also still thinks I'm cool most of the time, so I'm trying to ride that way as long as I can.
that's awesome. Yeah, my oldest is in kindergarten, and we're homeschooling him now, but might send him to public school next year. We're trying to
Mhm.
figure that out. But he's such a little guy, and so me and my wife kind of stress about the idea of him going on the bus by himself. He's like, oh, he's just a little guy, but
Oh, yeah, we
it's
didn't do it in
yeah,
kindergarten, we were in a different but we transferred to the school we're in now in 1st grade, and when she did it, I had so much anxiety. She didn't, but I did. They
yeah,
are
yeah,
little. Like, how do you
yeah.
get from the bus to your classroom?
Yeah.
They all figure it out, all the and everybody does it, there's a lot of great teachers, but yeah, it's a moment.
For sure, for sure. Well, Karen, I'm so excited to have you on the show, and it's good timing because you just wrote a book and released it. The kind of book release party in Atlanta is tomorrow, and I'll be going. Really excited to see it and to read it. But tell us a little about who you are and what you do, and then I want to talk about your book, which is called "Funding Your Mission" and is about nonprofit finance.
Yes.
But yeah, tell us about kind of who you are, what you do, and then how why you're writing a book about nonprofit finance.
Sure, yeah, my name is Karen Hoden, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Infinite Giving. And we are a financial technology company as well as an investment advisory firm that works exclusively with nonprofits. So we're a fiduciary partner to them. And we are one place where we can help them receive donations, manage those donations, and grow those donations. We serve hundreds of nonprofits all over the US. And as we continue to advise and work alongside them, I've found that I have a unique voice because I have been a nonprofit executive director and founder. And I
Mm,
also have served on boards where, the board of a higher ed institution, Berry College, I'm on the board of trustees. We have a very
mm,
small $2 billion endowment. Right. At the same time, I also serve on other smaller nonprofit boards where we're desperately trying to build up a 6 month reserve fund. But no matter where I've fallen in that work, it also has this underlying need for how can we improve understanding of what finances look for nonprofits. And
yeah,
we give a lot of the same kind of advice and guidance over and over and over again, no matter where they are in the country, no matter what industry you're served. There's always nuances and different needs, but a lot of the patterns continue of like, how much reserve should we have? Are we, especially as
right.
Christians, like, is that a lack of faith if we have reserves, or
Mm,
is that stewardship? And kind of living in that tension, like, can Christian organizations have an endowment?
right,
Right? Or
right.
is that hoarding funds? So you can
Yeah,
look at two sides of these and kind of the struggle through the faith lens of what that means. But we love to live in this space of what if we does God really call us to a scarcity mindset?
yeah,
Or
yeah.
does God call us to really thoughtful stewardship and a promise of abundance? And
Mm,
in the nonprofit finance lens, like abundance sometimes can feel uncomfortable. So it's also strategy, right? And sustainability. So
yeah,
the vision for the book, which is funding your mission, it's the nonprofit finance kind of modern guide to nonprofit finance. It talks a lot about the journey through the lens of this like tension, right? Of in the nonprofit world, is scarcity mindset noble? Is that right? It's not. If you're a nonprofit leader, you're exhausted by it, right? And then we can
right.
get into overhead myth and all of these different pieces. But ultimately, it's looking at how do we bring more organizations and these incredible leaders doing some of the most important work in our communities and bring them from a scarcity mindset, give them a really sound strategy that works
Yeah,
uniquely for them to move from that strategy into sustainability, which,
yeah,
as a Christian nonprofit leader, that does feel like abundance if you're able to be sustainable. And ultimately the bigger mission is that that sustainable organization can serve their community and people better, right? It's the trust of, we're going to be there, we're going to show up, we're going to continue this great work and support you. And that's, I think, a lot of where, Christian love comes from.
yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting because, like, serving, growing nonprofits and having those nonprofits be able to serve people better, that's a part of the financial health of, of nonprofit institutions. The other thing that comes to mind is the ongoing existence of those nonprofits. And, it's not lost on me, having built Simple Charity, you're a founder as well, in these early
Hmm.
years, within the first 5 years, something like 50% of nonprofits will shutter their doors. And
Hmm.
so, this idea of how to actually manage the finances of the institution in such a way that you're protecting your cash flow, that you have this vision for the future, and that you're able to attract funders who value that kind of financial management and build trust with them in order to obtain greater, larger grants from people who have the capacity to do that. And so, you tell me the story of your journey of founding a nonprofit, because I think that will help bring some context as well of why you're doing what you're doing. But yeah, give us the inside story of the organization that you founded and led.
Yeah, it was called the Do Good Initiative, and we worked in coffee farming communities in Rwanda in East Africa. And so quite different from my day to day that I do now, but spent a lot of time over there, worked directly in communities, did a lot of community led projects in partnership with the folks who lived there. But we built a school that still educates over 400 children in rural Rwanda every year. We did a lot of homes and orphan care, again, all in partnership with the communities of how do we help them have more sustainable, positive living environments and movement forward in that economy, in that local community. So loved it, but lived in that scarcity mindset. And I didn't know
Mm,
better. Right. And
yeah,
no one tells you differently. Right. And it was
yeah.
my whole identity. Right. Almost got slightly unhealthy. So then, like, in that scarcity mindset, and this is your whole identity is like, we're doing this work and God called me to this
Yeah,
work and no time off. And like, there's always work to be done and like money in and money out immediately. Um, and I loved it, but I experienced scarcity mindset and burnout from that.
yeah.
And so 7 years in, I actually ended up passing a lot of the work that I was doing over to another nonprofit in the area called Kula. Serve on their board, still support them to date, and they've grown the work that they're doing much bigger even than anything that I did. And so really proud of Kula and all the work that they have done and love still being involved. But I think it's, now they're a client of Infinite Giving and they have a
Oh,
6 month
cool.
reserve fund and they're thinking big picture and have a lot of thoughtful stewardship on how they want to run. And, from there, one of my largest donors knew a guy in the tech community. And I got, ended up essentially building a 10-year career in the tech ecosystem here in Atlanta. I was vice president of Atlanta Tech Village. I then became a venture partner with a venture firm.
Mm,
And I think not a lot of people have served on both sides, right? Of this finance and tech and venture, and also the nonprofit where you're like
yeah,
celebrating a $25 gift online, right? And I still sit in that dichotomy a lot with Infinite Giving, and it's a beautiful place to be because you can
yeah,
see the impact that both kind of sides can bring, right, to good work. And so I often say I wish that more nonprofits operated like businesses and allowed themselves to think that way. You have overhead, you have payroll, you have work to be done.
yeah,
Like it's different, but there's also a lot of similarities. So I wish that nonprofit leaders could take the best from business practice, sound business practices, but I also wish more businesses could learn from nonprofits and be able to take a lot of
mm,
those, their work and do a lot more good and look for positive, ethical ways to have impact on their communities. So I feel like if we could continue to learn from each other, it becomes a tax exempt status, right? Where you're like, hey, this is a
yeah,
business, but tax exempt status. And that introduces, a lot of complexity and compliances and stewardship and responsibility because donor dollars are different. But it doesn't change a balance sheet, right? And
mm,
how we want to do the work and how we want to build into sustainability. And I think a lot of that is we have to give ourselves permission to steward our funds well. I love to get back to the parable of the talents just because it's low hanging fruit, right? But I'm like, no, 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 we're not. We're called to steward what we've been given really well. And when a donor
right,
is giving a nonprofit, and generous donors who are listening now, like when you give that organization those funds, you want to know that it has this impact, but you want to know that you're leaning into something sustainable rather than you are, saving them for another 6 months and then what's going to happen. And so I think that's the tension where we live in a lot is that these leaders, nonprofit leaders are like, no, money in, money out, sustainability,
yeah,
scarcity, burnout.
yeah,
And then these not the big generous givers who have the ability to fund and kind of have these wealth conversations are like, "Ooh, that's not gonna I want to have a bigger impact. Let's go look for a bigger organization who can take my bigger gift." And then all of a sudden the big organizations continue to be big, the smaller organizations continue to be small,
Right.
and I really feel like we
Which,
can cross that bridge in a better way.
yeah. Yeah, well, one effect of that, I think, is that that makes there be less innovation in the space. Like
Yes.
if you have a system where, start ventures are dying left and right, then
Mhm.
new ideas in
Mhm.
kind of social impact or in kingdom work rarely become fully realized.
Right.
And okay, so you've hinted at this tension a little bit, and I kind of want to talk about it. So, like, can nonprofits save too much money? Like is like, is there a balance here? And it sounds like you think there is a balance, and I think saving a 6 month cash reserves feels like a modest and responsible thing to do, especially in a world where nonprofits that are dependent on federal funding, we've seen such significant swings in the availability of federal funding this year. So those nonprofits that were dependent on federal funding and did not have 6 months cash reserves are underwater right now. They're
Yeah.
underwater. Um, and um, and then if you're going to have 6 months of cash reserves, and let's say let's say you're $1 million organization, it's $500,000 that if you just have that as cash, you're leaving money on the table. If you're not doing anything, actually you're losing money if because of
Yep.
inflation. um, so so all that feels really kind of responsible and kind of um not like a no-brainer, but like makes a lot of sense if you stop and think through the issue. But I also know of some nonprofits, I look at the balance sheet and frankly I'm like, you guys need to get moving. Like, what are you doing? I mean, there are rich nonprofits and poor nonprofits. And so can nonprofits be kind of overly wealth oriented, you think?
I do have thoughts, but I think it
I don't know
is
if you're in
every
position to share your thoughts as the
yeah, no, and I'm happy
I mean,
to. I just want to preface it that I think every organization is different.
yeah,
The most important thing, at least to me, and kind of as we advise different nonprofits, is to understand what the money's purpose is and why it is where it is.
yeah,
Right? If it's like, oh, we're just continuing to grow reserves and we have this, big bucket of money. Yeah, why? Like, why is it there? That doesn't mean you have to deploy it, but we love to and bucketing money is like an informal term that we use just because it's really approachable, but it's like, great, let's define what these funds are. And often
mm,
these organizations are like, oh yeah, like it technically you're looking at the bank account, but in the spreadsheet we know this is actually kind of over here and this is designated funds over here. But there's a lot of key stakeholders in a nonprofit, and the best way to kind of know and understand the purpose of the funds is to go through the exercise, and we do that. Where it's like, all right, how much reserves is comfortable to you? Right? And define it. And it's amazing how many nonprofits do not have this defined, right? And we think
right,
of it as a monthly budget. There's a lot of right ways to do things, right? But we're just like pre-COVID, you would hear 3 to 6 months being very standard for like operational reserve funds. So to your point, if you're $100,000 a month organization, that would be $600,000, of a
yeah,
savings. Post-COVID, 6 to 12 months is much more common. And a
mm,
lot of that is, we felt it for the first time of like, oh, this is what happens. This is why we have a savings account. It's just the same thing you do for your family. Like, right, ideally we have a savings account. What if someone loses a job or somebody gets sick or has an accident? How do we keep the mortgage for our family? How do we make sure
yeah,
we have food on the table? Same basic principle applies to nonprofit organizations and businesses, right? It's like, no, 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 that's not irresponsible to have money. That's responsible. Okay, well, let's talk about what feels responsible because again, nonprofits are a little different. And so we usually say, great, 6 to 12 months. sometimes we serve, health clinics and things who have a little bit more, steady income. And so maybe they're more comfortable with a 3 to 4 month. Again, everyone's different, but the important thing is to define that. And then, great. Do you own a building? Well, you need maintenance. What's going to happen if you, like, how many organizations do capital campaigns to build, but then the HVAC
Yeah.
goes out, or they need to replace the carpet, or every 7 years you need to paint, every 20 years you need a new roof. Same thing we do for our homes, right? We're like, oh, adulting is really hard. Like, how do we
Yeah.
financially prepare for this? So then we usually say, great, let's do a maintenance account. Do you have designated projects? Do you have endowments? And then we start to look at that big picture of what are your funds? And we are a fiduciary. So there are definitely times where if you just say, oh, this is just our operational reserve fund, we've got 24 months in there, we usually push back a little bit and say, great, that feels really high for an operational reserve fund. Should we bucket those differently? Like, is there another purpose? Do you have all of these? And then if they do have that covered, we're like, great, is there a plan to deploy that? Is there a project?
Right.
Is this a 1 year plan, 3 year plan? Is it a building purchase? But we don't want to deploy funds if they have not started to build up a proper financial structure.
Yeah.
So ultimately, I think, is there a point? Yes. But I think every org is a little bit different. And the biggest, value add in this stewardship piece is to really identify what is the purpose of those funds. Are they restricted? Are they designated? And are we building a foundation? Occasionally we have people come to us and they're like, great, we have a donor and they want to do an endowment. And I'm like, great. People have a lot of big feelings, especially in the Christian world, about endowments.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and I will
You
say,
wrote
great.
you wrote an article. You wrote
Yeah,
an article for this. You want to Google you.
I have.
Uh, uh,
Yes, there's another one getting ready to come out soon too. But it is an interesting kind of thought process, and we go back to kind of the first milestone of like, tell me about your reserves.
right.
Are you in a month to month mindset? And often they're like, no, we've got like 2 months of reserves. Excuse me. So, like, we don't need to be talking about endowments, right?
Right.
But
Right.
if you are at a place where you're like, hey, we have a pretty healthy 15 months of reserves, great. Well, let's take 3 months of that, seed an endowment, and start thinking longer term. But in order to
Mm,
do endowment, you have to be in a long term kind of thinking. You're thinking in 5 and 10 year cycles.
yeah.
And so we just want to make sure it has purpose. The whole
Yeah.
other side of that is those folks who have endowments. Is that wrong? Is that hoarding? Is that
Mm-hmm.
living in
Mm-hmm.
abundance? Is that stewardship? And again, I don't
Yep.
know where your thought lies. I'm always like, it's about the intention behind it. It's often
Yeah.
about the donor's wishes. Like, how dare we say a donor who wants to leave a legacy gift is not, following their faith in that gift.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
most really, successful business people understand sustainability. They
Yeah.
understand legacy, and it is their funds that God has allowed them to have, and they want
Yeah.
to be philanthropic. And to
Yeah.
me, if I knew that I could give one gift, say it's $1 million, just because that's a nice big round number that every nonprofit would be thrilled to have, right? $1 million endowment could provide, at a minimum, $50,000 a year
Yep.
that they are not fundraising, that could provide scholarships, that could have impact. And that goes for decades. That would go through my
Yeah.
life, that would go through my daughter's life.
Mm-hmm.
And you start to see this legacy. What a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
And is that right? And so to me, that would be, well, that's honoring, as long as that's what is helpful to the nonprofit, but it requires a different mindset.
Yeah, for sure. I have admittedly mixed feelings,
Mhm.
because I do think that giving that $1 million in that way is better than a lot of other things you can do with $1 million. And and I certainly think we have to honor the intention of givers and donors, um, and at the same time, uh, I don't know. I mean, I have all these mixed feelings of like, can we get more work done
Mhm.
to do good?
Yeah.
You know,
I
and
the
so
Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead. Well, I was gonna say one thing I do want to define just for listeners because there's a few different places where there's pots of money in the kind of philanthropy world. And when we're talking about nonprofit endowment, I do want to just define that that's different from a private foundation. And
Yes,
just to be clear, so this is the money is owned by the nonprofit. It's on the
correct.
balance sheet of the 501(c)(3). It's not on the balance sheet of the private foundation.
Correct.
So in addition to the money that's in nonprofits, there is, and we've talked about this, $2 trillion in private foundations and donor advised funds. And so, to me, even in that situation, like for like I'm very passionate about how do we accelerate the payouts of private foundations and donor advised
Oh,
funds.
yeah, you and I can go hard there, I agree, especially donor advised funds, it's tough.
Yes. Yes. Well, it's funny. Donor advised funds, everyone takes shots at them my LinkedIn. I think the LinkedIn algorithm knows that I have this viewpoint. So it just feeds me people kind of railing about DAFs. But private foundations are the same. But they're a little
I
bit
think the
more
difference is they have
sacred
legislation. So, right? So foundations have legislation where they have to give at
governing.
least 5%, right?
Yes,
Whereas
this is
staffs
true.
don't have legislation, and we're just seeing it grow by leaps and bounds.
Well, part of the reason it's growing is that now people are allocating their 5% payouts just directly into Fidelity Charitable and Schwab Charitable. And so you
Yeah.
see, if you look at the tax returns of some private foundations, and that way they can grant discreetly. So they're, which is a benefit. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you just take that 5%, put it in a DAF and then don't grant that, that's just a loophole. I mean,
Yeah.
it just kind of totally negates the purpose of that original legislation.
It
Um,
does. And I love that you called out because these are two very different conversations, right? And
Right,
so
right,
for
right.
me, when a donor is granting a large gift to a nonprofit and they want to do a legacy gift and they're like, hey, this is the impact, this is what we want, this is the vision. I like the conversation of endowments because it also kind of requires that nonprofit to manage those funds in some way with more defined intention. Because occasionally we do talk to nonprofit leaders who are like, man, we had a great 3 years because we had a donor give us $2 million. And then they come to us and they're like, but we spent it all and now we can't pay our people.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I was like, oh, so when people get big gifts and they all just want to deploy all of it, I usually
Right.
am like, let's define all of this is going to go to programming, yes, and of course donor wishes, but I'm like, do we have a chance to build sustainability? Do we have a
Yeah.
chance to build up a savings or maybe seed a quasi endowment or
Mhm.
some kind of moment there? Those
Yeah.
opportunities and the ability to enter into those conversations, I feel like small to mid-sized nonprofits desperately need to do that because we have donors who love
I
to
agree with
give
that.
endowments and they go to higher ed, they go to all these other organizations. And I'm like, what about the 90% of nonprofits who are not these massive institutions? What if they had the infrastructure to say yes to donors? I get pastors and executive leaders in churches all the time who are like, we have donors who want to do that, but the church can't accept an endowment. And I'm like, why? And we'll talk through it. And
Yeah.
they're like, I don't
Yeah.
know. I just thought we weren't supposed to. And I'm
Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah, right.
the donor. And I'm like, well, did the
Sounds
donor
like a
give
good
you?
idea.
Right. And they're like, no, the
Yeah.
donor wanted to give in that way. So they send the money elsewhere. And I'm like, hey, there's ways we can structure this where it honors the church and honors your faith, but it honors the donor. That being said, when we're talking about donor advised funds, it's so beautiful for donors, right? You get your tax break. There's no rush. You can figure out what you want to do with the money. You can let it grow. Where I struggle, to your point, is that there's billions and billions of dollars sitting in these on donor advised funds. There's over 300 DAF holders right now in the US, right? And they're
Yeah.
growing and they're all making a lot of money, which is why it's
Yeah.
growing. All of these funds are earmarked for nonprofits, but they are not getting to the nonprofits. And for
Right.
us, we serve the nonprofit organizations, not the donors. And so these nonprofit leaders are like, I love that these donors feel great about giving to philanthropy, but it's not even slightly keeping up. So it's this great tax vehicle. and it's encouraging philanthropy. But meanwhile, it's just growing. And I'm an investment advisor too. It's growing, right? And they're making money on it. And there's no legislation and no requirement to buy it down. And
Yeah.
everyone feels good. And the nonprofits are like, great, but that money's still not getting to us.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
that's
that's
right.
where I really struggle, and that's why we offer endowments a lot, is we're like, "Great, these donors wanna make legacy gifts big, like, how do we funnel it in a way where those nonprofits can benefit, immediately from a very generous gift, but it has similar infrastructure where it can be invested, it can grow, it can build sustainability, but it's not about a third party holder just sitting
Yeah.
indefinitely, it's about putting the money to work."
Yeah. Yeah, that's great, Karen. I think one of the things I'm sensing is that might be a source of our slightly different, though mostly aligned perspectives on this is that you are serving nonprofits.
Mhm.
And from the perspective of a nonprofit, if a donor calls and says, I want to give you an endowment, the right answer to that is yes, thank you.
Right.
And to your point, I mean, to the church, like you just say yes. You said, thank you for
Mhm.
this wonderful gift. And it is a wonderful gift. And again, there's all sorts of things you can do with money, and giving an endowment to a church is not a bad use it's a
Right,
fantastic use of wealth.
right.
And at the same time, I think at Simple Charity, we serve the donors and are helping them in their journey to make these philanthropic decisions. And in a world with $2 trillion of charitable assets, before the endowments and everything, I mean, I feel this strong bias towards deployment,
Yes.
sunsetting. Can you add a sunset clause? Have you thought about that? Have you talked about that? If you want to set up a private foundation for generations, your kids are going to have to deal with it. Have you talked to your kids about that? Do they want to run the private foundation? Do you think their kids are going to want to? And because then what you also see is kind of generation two, G2, G3, running these family foundations and not having fun.
Mhm.
It sounds like a really fun thing, to just kind of give away, this wealth and this someone else's money. But unfortunately, you do get these cases of, it's
Mhm.
not uncommon for, there to be a kind of question in a family of who's going to run the family foundation. Um, and so, anyways, I say all that to say, you know, uh, like I think my default counsel with someone who's considering an endowment would be, could you give this money as an endowment to this nonprofit, but could you have a kind of sunset date even for that? And I know this is this idea. First of all, is that possible? Is that
Yeah,
like
it's
who
it's a
structured an
term
endowment?
endowment. It's called a term
Okay,
endowment. Mhm.
yeah,
And even
yeah,
when we do it, we live in the world of, like, quasi endowments a lot is where we recommend, is it gives the nonprofit the ability to say, "Hey, we are gonna steward this, we're gonna invest it where we can pull off
yeah.
this stipend every year." But if needs of the organization change, the church's needs change, we have the ability to draw that down if or when needed. And so it
Oh, okay,
always gives
yeah,
those, or that's a quasi endowment or a board restricted endowment, and it gives them the ability to where it's not locked up forever. That's like a true restricted endowment. We don't really do those. We can, but we usually advise against that, to your point of
cool.
like, hey, we don't know. So as long we usually write the agreement where there's some type of clause that says, under extenuating circumstances, if the needs of the organization change, these funds can be accessed as long as they're used to move the mission of the organization forward. And
That's
so
awesome.
that it protects the funds, it gives it purpose, but it also gives you flexibility that it's like, guess what? If those need to be deployed and you have a full board vote and it's used to move the mission of the org forward, let's do that. Right? So the donor can make concessions on that, but and the buy down and the sunsetting would be a term agreement. Like, hey, we're gonna invest this for 20 years. After that, instead of a 5% disbursement, we're going to do a 20% disbursement and we'll
Right.
eventually buy it down. So there's a lot of different ways you can do it.
Yeah. So going to that example of a church. So let's say a church, received an endowment, and then the church is growing.
Mhm.
They're like, we need to make an addition to our building to have more space for all these people. Is that a use case where they could kind of tap into that endowment, and maybe instead of doing like a big capital campaign or something, they could use those funds? Or
It depends on how we write the investment policy statement and the endowment agreement and the intentions behind it. So there's a lot of like
Uh,
nuances around that. Generally, though, I would say no, because that is a capital campaign.
right.
And that is very different, right? If you were to endow like a church, often it would be like, hey, we want to be able to pay for a pastor's salary so that this community and this church has leadership, and that when we start to do capital campaigns and funds, it's going to the community, not just like trying to pay a salary, right? So
Yeah.
I think there's different ways that you can think about the purpose and the intent on when it would make sense.
Mm,
Um, Versus, great, I like yeah, because what they're two it's just two very different pathways of like, "Hey, I wanna build a building." That's cool, that's a legacy, that building's gonna age, that building has repairs, that is a certain purpose. An endowment is usually something more lasting, that is more operationally or program-minded versus, a capital expense.
so, in this case, then, if you needed to kind of tap into the endowment funds, that would be because of some sort of, emergency or something like that,
Maybe
and then
the
you could.
churches are merging with another church, or maybe, hey, this community doesn't need this anymore. We want to give it to this ministry. Or I think there's other examples where we want to give you flexibility, but also maintaining the original purpose of the endowment.
Yeah.
Recently, one of our clients, actually, a donor gave them an endowment, and it was outside of the capital campaign, but they were like, "Hey, we're doing an active campaign," and they're like, "We want to do an endowment that will maintain the building." And I was like,
Mm,
"This is really wise," right? Where they were like,
yeah,
"No one wants to give to that. We get that. Expenses are going to happen, repairs are going to
yeah,
need to happen.
yeah,
So what if we just say, "Hey, we're going to do this," and then every year there's $20,000 or $10,000 to go towards, repairs and improvements." So there's
yeah.
different ways.
Y that's really helpful. I'm thinking of the giver side of the equation.
Mhm.
I'm curious about what Christian philanthropists should better understand about nonprofit finance. And maybe we could talk about a few different topics here. One of the things I'm interested in is the overhead myth. So you mentioned that you write about that in your book. What is the overhead myth, and why is that important for givers to understand?
The overhead myth essentially comes from, I believe it was in the 1990s, right? Susan G. Komen got a lot of pushback on kind of their ratio of programming versus overhead. It's a touchy subject, right? But I will say that Charity Navigator, GuideStar, all of these big organizations who are overseeing the ethics of the deployment of funds for these nonprofits actually got together and wrote a letter. And they said, this is not a fair assessment. And so there was a lot of like media backlash and donor backlash, but we forget that they provided millions and millions of dollars for really good work against, breast cancer research. And I like my mom passed from breast cancer. So like I have and I'm
Mm,
like, no, Susan G. Komen's awesome.
mm,
Was that a high overhead? Yes. Right. But the reason they're a household name is because they had a high overhead.
yeah,
Right. And so I'm not saying that was right or wrong or any of that. It's just saying that that metric that because of that got really ingrained in general knowledge and expectations of the donors.
yeah,
And that is not no business. Again, tax exempt is its status. Nonprofit is a tax exempt status. They still have overhead. They still have buildings. They have salaries. They have insurance. No one's winning best paid salary. Like you can always go work for a for profit and make more money, right?
mm,
So it's that element of what would be a horrible business practice. All of a sudden, we say this is how a nonprofit has to run
yeah,
no matter what their outcomes are, right? Like they
yeah,
had incredible outcomes. And so when you have Charity Navigator and GuideStar saying this is not a fair metric, the backlash was still there. And so then there's this whole movement, right? Where all of a sudden nonprofits, that's where the scarcity mindset came from. Is that okay? Well, we can't spend money there. We can't pay people. That's why there's more burnout in the nonprofit sector than anywhere else that
mm,
I know of, right? Or it's up there, and there's this scarcity mindset that's exhausting because we feel that pressure of like can't have more than 10%. I can't. I have to. It's like well, this is a slight metric, but in donation pages, you have this really big push towards transaction fees, right? In infinite giving, we're a flat monthly rate, right? Very low, $99 a month. And we literally have nonprofits who are like, I would rather pay 10 or 15% of every donation rather than pay $100 a month.
Wow.
And that comes from that mindset of they're like, no, no, because that's on my balance sheet. And then people will look at that and be like, I have to bring all of my spending down, and it keeps them in the now. And I'm like, yeah, but let's run the math. Like, this is a
Yeah.
fraction. And then you can tell donors this full amount goes to you, and they live in that tension. So I think when you're like, what do we wish they knew? That pressure is not a fair pressure. There are
Yeah.
TED Talks about it. There's a whole different way of thinking where we have to then challenge that mindset and say, when you're giving, is it really about the percentage and the ratio of what went to what? Or do you care that that executive director is leading an organization, is passionate about the cause, and is doing good work? And guess what? Is that good work measurable? Yes.
Right.
Those are
Right.
the important metrics that I think we should hold nonprofits more accountable. And if donors could relieve some of that, then that also, which is also where endowments and financial management, because they're like, oh, wait, we're allowed to have this on our balance sheet. And I'm
Yep.
like, that's thoughtful stewardship.
Yeah.
Not crazy, like you're saying, not just unpurposeful funds, but it's like, oh, we have a 12-month reserve fund. Here's where it's there. We have nonprofit leaders all the time that are like, I'm afraid XYZ donor is going to see that we have a reserve fund and not give us money. And I'm like,
Do
that is such a hard place to live in. And to
you think
me, it's
those
not
fears are real?
either. What's
Do you
that?
think those fears are real, or do you think there is this kind of pressure from the donor community to kind of squeeze every ounce of juice out of the lemon, for nonprofits to frankly, I mean, I hate to say it like this, but sometimes it feels like there's pressure for nonprofits. If you work in a nonprofit, you better be working harder than you
Yeah,
work in a business. I mean,
right.
I have friends in Atlanta who make way more money than me and work way less than me.
Mhm.
Is just a fact. And you could find jobs like that in the corporate world, but the nonprofit world, it's like there's this moral pressure.
Yes.
And I don't know if it's real or imagined. Like, I don't know if
I think it's very real. And if you ask any nonprofit leader, it's real. Now, does that mean all donors do that? Not at all, right? But it's a very real framework that is, and I went and spoke to, we have a client here, and they, excuse me, they have, there was about 80 board members. They're a national organization. They have a lot of different board members. And I taught a workshop, and I was talking about moving from scarcity to strategy. And instead of using sustainability, because they're very faith driven, I use the word abundance.
mm,
Um, some of them were so uncomfortable. And I enjoyed that because I'm like, it's good dialogue. Let's just talk about it. Like,
yeah,
why you're not wrong, but like, let's work through the tension of that. Um, but I just don't think it's not a fair place to be, but it is very real. And a lot of
yeah,
that then comes from unfair expectations, a lack of understanding, right? Of like, is this even reasonable? Like, how are we supposed to do all of this work with like a 10% overhead? That's
right,
ridiculous. Again, like, it's just not feasible. And that's what then caused us to underpay people, where there's churn all the time. And again, I lived that life. Like, I remember like being in Rwanda, and I was like, I can't take money for that. And I was making pennies, right? And it was just a whole different mindset. So that's where a lot of what we do at Infinite Giving and in the book, Funding Your Mission, is like, how do we reframe these conversations to where
mm,
it's about thoughtful stewardship and intentionality around funds. It's not about hoarding.
yeah,
It's not about not having faith. It's not about not wanting to deploy the funds, because that's why we're here, is to do the good work. But there is a balance of, hey, we should have reserves. Hey, we should be able to, give someone a raise when they're doing really good work. We should be able, when we need to replace something
yes,
on a broken building, we should be able to do that. And sometimes we are so worried about programs and the overhead that we start extending programs that are not sustainable. And then it becomes the problem of, okay, well, you just launched a new program out of passion and good intention, and someone gave money for here. But guess what? It funded it for 6 months. And now all those people who we built relationships with, we have to like, oh, we got to fundraise to keep the lights on. Like we're back into this.
Mm,
And you're like, does that do more harm than good?
yeah,
Sometimes like, what if we paused programming, built a really solid foundation, which is hard to do when you know that good work has to happen. But
yeah,
it live in
yeah.
that tension and live with intentionality and faith that it will come and we can do that. And then we're stewarding those funds well and with purpose, and then start to deploy programs that we know are sustainable.
Yeah, that's good. Like I said earlier, I feel like you're talking towards the nonprofits. I'm trying to translate and think what is the
Yeah.
message here for givers? And I think one of the messages here is that givers actually have the power to influence whether or not nonprofits have a scarcity mindset or abundance mindset. And the
Yes.
kind of posture that givers bring to the table trickles down into these organizations and affects outcomes. And ultimately, when we think about evaluating charities, like we look at organizational health and outcomes per dollar, and that's kind of
Mhm.
outcomes per dollar given.
Yeah.
And we, have a model where if you give a dollar to a charity, it goes into four buckets. It goes into the program expenses, into fundraising expenses, into administrative expenses, and then into reserves. And there's a difference between the revenue and expenses of an organization. And so what we're interested in is take all those buckets and what is the cost, the full cost of each
Mhm.
outcome. And so, I feel like sometimes nonprofits do this thing where they're you know, like $2,500 will, provide a orphan with housing for a year. And that's just the program, like that's the actual expense line. But
Right.
it's not $2,500. It's actually $3,000 because the overhead is part of the cost of being a business, and the reserves are part of the
Right.
cost of being a business. So part of the way we, I guess, try to, I don't know, influence this conversation is reporting information to donors of here's the total cost of achieving outcomes, and that cost includes all costs of doing business for the
Yes.
nonprofit. And
I love
so, but I think, yeah, I guess what's your message for donors? Like, how can donors, I mean, I just think I think it's this idea of kind of being lavishly generous.
Yeah.
Like this is not, you know, making it not a transaction, but
And
actually to say like there's enough in the kingdom of God. Like we want these nonprofits to feel the enough that there's enough.
yeah.
And they're going to do the best work if they're healthy. And uh and so I think that's the kind of spiritual component of this kind of generosity that says like I'm not just, trying to maximize my ROI, but I'm trying to
Mhm.
do something good and true and beautiful for the long haul that is not just about achieving this thing, but also the means is also good. You know what I mean? Like we're not
Yeah.
like exploiting these nonprofit work because honestly, at the end of the day, the danger is the donor is kind of exploiting the nonprofit workers in order to achieve some, hyper efficient outcome versus blessing them so that they can also, you know, accomplish their mission well.
It's being gracious and giving. Right? It's like, let's be grace-filled and gracious, and we're gonna trust this organization to do the work that they know well. We are going to not make demands that are unreasonable in this, like, overhead myth. It doesn't mean that there's not a high standard, it doesn't mean that there's not stewardship required, but that we can be gracious and trust the teams and the organization to do the job well. The other side of that is a lot of these generous givers and donors are sitting on boards, and boards have like, that's a whole other conversation
I'm
podcast
glad you
probably.
brought this up. I'm glad you brought
Yeah,
this up. We should talk about boards too. Yes.
yeah, because it's boards, like, they have a fiduciary responsibility, and they're good intended people, they're volunteers, And often we see boards are often the worst like piece of getting in the way of these organizations doing really good work. Or if they're
Mm,
like, no, we want to have good stewardship. We want to be able to pay over here. The board's saying no. My brother's uncle's mom can go do this for us. And you're like, well, great, but like I want a professional and we want like when you because you rely on volunteers, there's different expectations if a board member's doing it, there's conflict of interest. Like there's all of these reasons on like how do we find good professionals, good stewardship. The boards are providing oversight, they're not doing the work. The boards are providing funding and the direction of different things. Like we have a prospect right now that we are talking to and they had a $9 million board designated endowment that is now dwindled down to about 2 million, and yet they have self-managed. And the idea of bringing someone in for them, there's still it's been 6 months of conversations. They're like, "We're just not sure." And I'm like, Whether it's me or somebody else, like, please bring somebody in to provide." And again, they're good people doing good work and they're smart. Some of them are very investment savvy, but it's about continuity. It's
yeah.
about being free from conflict of interest. And so as these donors are listening, it's like, "Hey, how do we be gracious in that and then get out of that scarcity mindset and overhead myth of saying no, let's find strategic partners, let's figure out ways to spend wisely but to do it in a way where we can steward what we have, we can provide solid guidance so that we can run efficiently and keep doing the good work we're doing."
Yeah. Yeah. That's so good. That's so good. I feel like underneath this conversation, Karen, is praxis.
I love praxis.
I
Yeah.
love praxis too. So praxis, for those of our listeners who do not know, is a uh, gosh, I feel like they would hate it if I called them a Christian accelerator, but that's kind of what they are. Uh, they're a venture
A
building
redemptive
ecosystem.
framework. They provide a
Uh,
redemptive
they
framework
provide a
for
redemptive framework. Yes.
entrepreneurs and funders of how do we do God's work within
Yes.
this framework of if we can empower Christian leaders to bring opportunities of as you said beauty and grace and good to the world, what would
Yeah.
that look like?
For sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, one of the things I learned from them was the idea of kind of multi-year unrestricted grants, and so that's
Oh,
advice we also give to our clients is if you have for your largest grants, if there are certain nonprofits that you're giving more than, I don't know, 10, $25,000 to, tell them your plan. Like you could call them or we can call them for you and say, over the next 3 years, we are planning on making this grant or the next 3 years or 5 years or however long, and we will tell you if that changes. And so I do think there are things on the donor side that can just make
yeah.
that scarcity mindset. I mean, I have, frankly, that is so rare. It is so rare to have that kind of upfront, candid communication from donors. And I think there's a this aspect of trust. I think trust-based philanthropy is like a also kind of a buzzy, slightly controversial
Mhm.
term. I had a mentor kind of argue that he said, I think we should have truth-based philanthropy. And I like that concept of, clear communication, um, of the nonprofits clearly reporting the outcomes back, and also nonprofits clearly communicating what they need. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? Like, to say I am burnt out. I
Yeah.
need a vacation, maybe a sabbatical, and I would love to still get paid. you know, or
Yeah.
at least, have my job waiting for me or I mean, but there's so many elements of this. I just had, 3 kids over the last 5 years is, ideas of paternity leave, maternity leave. There's ideas of benefits and all the just taking care of the people who work for
Yeah.
nonprofits is the kind of thing that I think donors and board members actually could be advocates for, because
Yes.
that is what results in organizational health. Of saying like, and I actually have some great board members do this for me. They're like, you know, Brian, how are you? how much are you working per week? How can we? And so I think that posture is gracious giving. To your
Mhm.
point, so Karen,
And the
go ahead.
truthful I love the truthful conversations too, because then
Yeah.
that's what moves giving from like transactional to wealth sharing conversations. Of we want to share our wealth and abundance with you as an organization. Here's what it looks like. And I would say the other flip side of that is when we're like, hey, to go back to what we were saying of like how what can donors do to help this scarcity mindset? Sometimes
Yeah.
having those conversations of saying, do you have reserves? Where are they sitting? I talk to people who have
Mm.
millions of dollars sitting in a checking and a low yield savings account all the time,
Karen,
right? And so
that
it's
that
like,
hurts my heart.
I know it's a thing. Like moving anything beyond the bank. A lot of nonprofits struggle with that. And so, and there's extremes on both sides and all of that, like thoughtful stewardship again. But having just those questions like, hey, I want to have a wealth sharing conversation. I want to be a gracious giver to you. Let's talk before we make these gifts, and it's not a conditional gift, but before we make them, do you have reserves? Are you operating a month to month or do you have reserves? And then if they say they have them, great. Where are they sitting? How are you
Mm,
stewarding what you've already been given? And simply asking those questions and giving them permission to either A, tell you without judgment and fear, or B, right? Again, it's wealth sharing. You're sharing your expertise in that too. It's also being like, oh, we don't. That also gives that gracious giver an opportunity to be like, hey, guess what? Well, this is best practices. And we want you to be able to continue the work, or if there's an emergency, this have. So maybe I would like 20% of each of my grants to go into a reserve fund. And
mm.
and we'll match it up to whatever, and that so I think there's ways where you can come alongside an organization just by the questions you're asking, how you're giving, what you're giving, and just trying to shore those expectations and that financial resilience up so that when you're making those multi-year grants, you're like, "Oh, okay, no, like we have these strong foundations in place so that the programming becomes easier and it becomes about programming rather than can we keep the lights on? How
Yep.
are our people doing?"
Yep. Karen, so good, so good. I'm just really grateful for your wisdom in this topic. I'm grateful for your new book, Funding Your Mission. Get on Amazon, I'm sure,
Yeah,
and
Amazon and Barnes and Noble. That's how you
Barnes
can
and
find
Noble.
it. Here's what it
Lovely,
looks like. Yeah.
awesome. If you're a nonprofit leader, it is a definitely buy it, read it, and if you're serious about your giving too, I think understanding the dynamics that we were talking about today of nonprofit
Yes.
finance and how to have organizational health will make people better philanthropists.
Yep.
And
We have a
so,
whole section about like boards, like how boards should be thinking about it, what their role is.
awesome.
So and we try to nonprofit finance, I know not everyone's running to the shelves to purchase it, but I think it's valuable and we try to write it in a way where there's storytelling, and engaging practical advice.
Love it. Yeah, I feel like as you have already impacted Simple Charity. We are
Mhm.
now a infinite giving client. I'm excited about that. But I just even think in our conversation so far, I think you're helping to shape my imagination for what how to plan and how to do this work for the long haul, and be healthy, and to
Yeah.
yes to grow, yes to make an impact, but can we have a nonprofit sector that is making a wonderful impact, where the organizations are growing and the people and the institutions are healthy?
Yes.
And, that is just having that imagination is powerful. And so anyways, I'm just personally grateful for your wisdom on this topic and, your voice and helping to educate people like me. So,
Yeah.
as we're wrapping up, Karen, our last question every podcast is, what are you learning in this season of life about what it means to love generously like Jesus? And you can take this anywhere you wanna go.
Oh gosh. Right. I mean, I there are a lot of directions we could take this. I think when I think about my company, right, Infinite Giving, and the conversations we have within the faith lens, um, I always want to go to, like, how do we define Christian love, right? And I always go to, Micah, where it's like, all right, we're going to do justly, we're going to love mercy, and we're going to walk humbly with our God. I then go to, what are the two greatest commandments, right? To love God, love each other. And then the third and final one is like my metric for how I think about it is like, what are the fruits of the Spirit? Gentleness, patience, kindness, self-control, all of those when I'm looking at, okay, this is faith. How do I live these things out? Because we can all get into all the different nuances of biblical translations and like different faith sectors and denominations and all of that. But I feel like we can all agree when you look through like the lens you're asking about loving and loving generously. If I can look at those kind of three, biblical references, that's how I want to live life. And that's how I want to kind of love my neighbors and my community and our clients and my family.
The invitation to grow this week is to look for ways you're currently walking in a scarcity mindset and to actively replace those thoughts and maybe some actions and maybe some systems with abundance and with gratitude and trust, believing that God has enough for you and slowing down to find that enough. Thank you so much to Karen Houghton for joining me on the show. Her new book is called Funding Your Mission, and you can get it on Amazon or at Barnes & Noble. If you have feedback on this episode, you can find me at brian@simplecharity.org. Next time, a conversation with the president of National Christian Foundation in Orlando about forming deep community with trusted friends that lasts decades. I hope you join me as we continue to learn to love generously like Jesus. Have a great week. See you next time.